I mean,
I'm just being confident. You told me I read it.
Okay, so my husband and I to round one of nationals while we're waiting for the live stream to get set up. We'll just do some quick introductions. So, kia ora, ko e lesu koingoa, I'm your educator. I prefer she or they pronouns. If you can tell me, in the order in which we'll be speaking within your teams, your name, your year level, and who will be doing the reply, please. So we'll start with the other team.
Hi, I'm Lucas. I'm the first speaker, and I'm also going to reply.
And he's year 13.
I'm year 15, sorry.
I'm Jamie, I'm the second speaker, I'm year 12.
I'm Lauren, I'm the third speaker, and I'm year 13.
Kia ora, and Bob.
I'm Saad. I'm year 15. First speaker.
Yeah. I'm Luca, I'm year 12 and second speaker and reply.
I'm Shiana, third speaker, year 15.
Excellent. Are we
Stream's good.
ready to go on the stream? Okay. So, a couple of quick housekeeping points since it's the first debate of the round, first round of the tournament. So, if we can all please remember to be courteous to one another. These rooms are very bouncy, the sound, because for whatever reason they decided to build them entirely out of glass. So just a note to speakers and also to people who are observing that the noise in this room gets a little bit louder than you might anticipate it to as a result of the size of the room. The second thing is that the round is being streamed. I hope that you've already said any preferences, but also just to let you know that if during the debate before your speech you wish to change your mind or change your preference, totally fine to do that. And also after the debate you can let us know if you want to take it down for whatever reason. In terms of points of information, we're going to be in the room, in person, which maybe you may or may not have done a lot of, so please just remember to be courteous during that process as well. So does anybody have any questions before we begin? No? Well then, to kick off the tournament for 2023, I'd like to welcome to the floor the first speaker for the other team here.
Just because I didn't clarify earlier, my pronouns are he, him. Private donations are one of the currently biggest obstacles to equality and representation, right? Insofar as it ruins equal representation and generally makes legislature worse, that is why we should instead have state-funded political parties instead of having these these voters giving them private donations to give them their funding. I'm going to do three things in my speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on why we get more diverse legislature, and then thirdly, then on why private donations fail in the status quo and what NEG has to defend in this debate. Firstly, on some setup, right? Note here, who are these private donators actually in the status quo? Three things on this. Firstly, we see that they're likely to be passionate voters who donate to support the party in the sense that they're likely to be very loyal and want to support the party in any way possible. Secondly, they're likely to be very rich actors and individuals who have wealth, and oftentimes they donate to benefit themselves in the sense of taxes being lowered or deregulation of certain industries. But also thirdly, note that they're likely to be big companies like Shell, who donate for the same incentives of these rich actors, but also includes lobbying power in terms of their active incentives, right? Note that the active implications of this is that private donations are disproportionately funded by actors who are incredibly rich or a variety of passionate voters in rich areas. What is our model then? Three things. Firstly, we see that there's likely to be a pool of money from taxes or state funds redirected to funding political parties. Secondly, this looks like equal level of funding. All political parties will get similar funding and has a baseline to ensure adequate functioning. But also thirdly, note that there's going to be a higher threshold to become a political party, right? You need a level of structure such as having economists, such as having accountants, and know that we won't fund parties with like 2 members or people who create political parties to just get the money from funding, right? Argument 1 then on why we just get more diverse legislature. 3 things on this. Firstly, note that what is the problem in the status quo, right? Note some context there that there are extremely dominant parties in the status quo who receive the most amounts of private funding. For example, this looks like the National and Labour Party in New Zealand, but also look like the Democrat and Republican population in the parties in America. What does this mean? 3 Three things on this. Firstly, know that this means that they have a large amount of outreach in the sense that they have lots of amounts of funding for marketing ads to continue being dominant. This is much more in this, and manifest in the way you see them. For example, on billboards, on your daily life, but also note in terms of how much they actually get engagement, right? You as an individual are likely to see these parties more just because they have more funding and advertising. But also secondly, note that they're also the most voted because they're also seen as having more capacity, right? If you see them being the most dominant because they have more money, you're likely to see them as having more capacity, so you vote for them. But also thirdly, note that they have capacity to shut down the advertising and shut down the power of lower parties, right? This looks like outbilling for a billboard to get the most outreach, or outfunding them to be able to get more proper advertisement or better advertisements in better areas. At the end of this, what you should believe is that these bigger parties have much more funding in the sense they're able to get more views, and that's why in the status quo, these are the dominant parties, and that's why they're the ones who individuals who are into politics know the most and don't know much about anything else. Secondly then, note why we just comparatively fix the problem when you're able to give them an equal amount of funding. Equal amounts of funding. Three things on this. Firstly, note that on a baseline, there's just high levels of funding for marketing ads. So just at the very base level, you're able to get more exposure to these ideas. So just more votes on these parties. When you're actually able to engage in the policies of Green, or if you're actually able to engage in the policies of ACT and actually see what they support, that's when you're actually able to give them more votes. That's when you actually to diversify your ideas and get a more diverse system. But also secondly, note that political parties just get much better and less radical when you're actually able to have money to hire things like consultants, right? When you're actually able to hire money to make your political party better by giving them more capacity. Thirdly, note that we just a good principle, right? When we're able to actually diversify and represent more people. Individuals then are no longer have to force to vote for the same ones because they're all exposed to. They're actually able to see more. They're actually able to see different parties with different policies, and that's what's most important. Thirdly, note then just why the quality of political parties improved then, right? Two things on this. Firstly, we redirect effort towards funding to more important issues when funding isn't a problem, right? In the status quo, political parties have to spend a lot of time attracting private fundings because that's what they base their money off of, right? Note that when you no longer have to worry about this, that's when you're able to spend more important time on more important issues. But also secondly, note that voter accountability still exists, right? The incentives still exist to pander towards the voters because you don't want them to vote for a different party, so you still have the same active incentives to give the voters what you want. At the end of this, what are the impacts then? Two things on this. Firstly, note that smaller parties are able to connect with larger parties, and we get greater representation of views and policies. But also note that this creates more equality and democracy when you can get a greater representation of views and more representative legislature. Secondly, note that votes in general are just likely to be more educated, and you're more able to know of these other policies and parties to make better and more informed decisions rather than just voting for the same two generic parties that you see currently in the status quo. Note here that this is important because you're actually able to feel like as a voter that you have control and information of what you're voting for. I'll take a point.
Yeah, will independent local MPs be state or privately funded?
They're still likely to be funded by the party in the sense that these ones who go under a party are likely to get funding the same way as they get from the party. Argument 2 then on why private funding fails. Note here, right? So two things on this. Firstly, let's just talk about why rich companies have more lobbying power when they are a private donator that can actually fund you. Some context here, right? I've already given to you some context in my characterization on why these individuals are the most funding, are the individuals who are likely to fund them the most. But also note that they're ones that also note that they have bad incentives in the sense that they are profit motivated, right? This looks like Google having a disproportionate amount of power and blocking parties from enacting legislature, for example, that prevents tech monopolies in like the US. Two things on this. Firstly, note that when you directly fund you and the party that you're in, that's when you have to cater to them most in the legislature as such parties because you rely on them for your funding, right? So the lawmaking is worse in the sense that you actually have to care about what they want instead of making the decisions that are best for the people. But also note secondly that they just have less lobbying power in private negotiations because they have less sway, right? They have much less sway when they try to talk you out in a dinner and make these decisions for you when you no longer have to depend on their policy, right? This means not only are these parties able to have better decisions, in the sense they're able to make more informed decisions that are best for the people and the voters rather than these monopolies or these parties or these private companies that are actively funding them. But that also means they're actually able to make promises or to have things that make policies that they care about. Secondly then, note then why private donors in the forms of voters are just extremely bad as well, right? Two things on this. Firstly, note just like this same analysis is true for rich actors and companies, right? But also secondly, note that for the average individual, this manifests in where you actually fund, right? When political parties have the active incentive to fund more rich areas because that's where they're likely to get the most like donors. That's when they're likely to get the most amounts of funding from the people in the area. That's when you're the worst off because that's when you disproportionately fund areas that are already developed instead of caring about minorities or areas who are poor who aren't able to donate to you. But also thirdly, note that it's just bad principally in the sense that we remove like a lot of avenues in which certain voters matter more, in which certain areas actually are more important. What are the end of this and what are the impacts on this? 3 things. Firstly, note that legislature is less likely to cater to rich donors or large corporations, which is just a benefit in general because you're able to get more diverse voters and actually have more equality in the voters that you care about. But also note how it's more important because we represent the majority of views better, right? Secondly, note that you're able to get more push for things like equitable regulation and policy, which is important because as people vote, right, you're actually more likely to be supported and feel a sense of security in the sense that you as an average voter now have more say because you're able to actually have change that matters to you rather than having change that directly influences rich areas and rich voters who are able to cater towards you. But also thirdly, note that we just have it's just more democratic, right? When you as an average voter actually has more choice, when you as an average voter actually feel like people care about you, when your vote actually matters to supporting the area that like benefits you, that's when voting is the best, and that's why you should stop private funding and switch to state funded policies. Thank you. Political parties, thank you.
Kia ora, I'm here, like the speaker for their speech, and I'll remind you again about points of information. I'm told I speak with a fairly quiet voice, and you can probably hear me. If that's the case, we can hear one another with fairly quiet voices. That being said, I'd like to welcome the first speaker for opposition, to the floor, open the case on the other.
3, 2, 1. A single mother who can no longer get healthcare for her child due to more nurses striking because they're not getting paid enough. She can't get to work because more bus routes were cancelled. The taxes that she's been paying to go towards these services are now going towards billboards for political parties she doesn't even agree with. She's angry, she's in pain, and she no longer trusts our political system. That's why we're so proud to oppose today. A few points of miscellaneous rebuttal before I get into my substantive material. Like, AFF needs to clarify how much money are these parties like actually getting paid. They've simply said that they're getting like equal levels of funding, but how do you get these massive amounts of outcomes, like these parties being so much more beneficial in terms of them being able to like hire more, being like more capacity for advertising without like a huge amounts of money going to each political party? We simply don't think that's feasible. In terms of the POI, we still didn't think that like the first AFF needed to clarify whether independents get money or not. This wasn't clarified by first AFF because of the POI. And in terms of, we had this huge push that this like advertising is extremely coercive because these big parties are getting so much money. The fact is, like, this is contingent on the fact that people are somehow stupid. We don't think that like poor people are just going to vote for National simply because they have more advertising. People are still like able to see, like able to talk about policies and understand what they're voting for and vote in their best interests. So where do these private donations come from? They come from supporters, constituents. We heard a lot of this on side F. For National, it looks like a bunch of farmers. For Labour, a bunch of union tragics. So 3 points in today's debate. Firstly, why state funding for parties is a drain on resources. Secondly, how politics improves on our side. Thirdly, why state funding is very bad for small parties. So what's our burden in today's debate? Tax money, if we can prove to you that tax money is better spent elsewhere or that private donations increases the efficacy of our political establishment, we win this debate. So firstly, on why state funding for parties is a drain on resources. Regardless of like their model, we think this is a massive drain on resources. So why do we need money to be spent elsewhere and not parties? Please note, like in New Zealand, we currently have firstly, we have a housing crisis. Secondly, the cost of living crisis is going up. This is like affecting a massive amount of people. Thirdly, we're like post-COVID, so we're in a recession. Fourthly, we're in huge debt as a nation. And fifthly, like our healthcare is under enormous stress. So are our educational institutions. We see so many strikes. NZ is in a terrible situation financially. We need money to fix these issues. State funding, advertising, and like going to these parties is taking away from these issues. So why will state funding be extremely costly? Firstly, big parties are massive. They're super expensive to run. You're actually running at like the detriment of a lot of parties, but especially these, and this goes for all parties, right? Because firstly, they have to advertise. Secondly, they need like offices, places to work. Thirdly, they need to pay for utilities. And fourthly, they have like staff they need to hire. So this means that secondly, and more importantly, this is like integrated rebuttal about their case. There are so many small parties, like for example, the top party, New Conservative, legalized cannabis, like so many parties that currently aren't getting voted in, and somehow we're giving them equal amounts of money to like bigger parties that normally have like more constituency. That's extremely harmful because the money has to be going to them in order for them to run. Even if there's only a small amount of money going to these small parties, it builds up because there are so many of them, as I've explained. And a lot of these parties like currently aren't even in parliament, so we think it's like a massive waste just like throwing money at them for no particular reason, even though they don't have a big enough constituency to get elected in the first place. Thirdly, more people would make parties, right? The state is literally funding them. There's no risk for people not simply just making parties. If I could make a party and not run like at the detriment of my finances, I would do that right away because the state is giving me money to do it. Because of all these mechanisms I've given you, I've described how this policy is going to be extremely costly. It's going to be to the detriment of the populace. This will only increase as time goes on because I've already explained to you why we're likely to see far more smaller parties emerge. So what occurs as a result of this drain on resources? Firstly, we have a sacrifice. We have to sacrifice in other areas of our establishment. The government's funding is stretched already. We can't even pay our teachers enough. They haven't gone a pay rise in a decade. That's terrible. Either we have to tax more to get this money to like fund this, or we'll have to use money out like from other projects and take away from other issues. So if tax increases, two things are going to happen. People are going to suffer. Cost of living already sucks. We're going to have to like tax a huge amount of people. But secondly, even if you're only taxing like extremely wealthy people, there's going to be public outrage. People are going to lose faith because they're getting taxed. And nobody really enjoys being taxed or secondly, the other comparative is money gets taken away from other services. This is far worse. That's what's going to happen on their side. Services suffer. We get less money for healthcare. Like I've already described to you how teachers are on strike. We definitely can't pay them. I mean, there isn't going to be able to we're not going to be able to fund a lot of social projects, which we think are really important. On the comparative, which is what we're defending, the status quo, tax money is spent on social projects, right? Projects that benefit everyone. This is a utility game, Judge. Like, we just simply get projects that benefit everyone on our side. Please note that somebody who's paying tax and tax is going to like parties they don't even support are going to feel ostracized. They're going to feel disengaged from their political establishment. We think it'd be far better for this money to be spent on infrastructure because not everyone is going to support every single party. Yes, I'll take your POI.
Wouldn't you agree that people are worse off when big private companies can lobby and coerce political parties to actively make bad decisions such as deregulation in industries that makes the life of everyone?
Okay, yeah, I understand this point, but the fact is, like, what's the comparative, Judge? They're just simply giving money out to everyone. We think that's far worse, even if you're able to stop these, massive corporations from just simply handing money out. What we think is worse is taking money away from healthcare, taking money away from our mental health institutions, taking money away from building our infrastructure. That's a far worse comparative. Like, even if you believed everything you say, this point just proves why, like, this is so detrimental because it affects everyone and the populace loses faith. They don't want to get taxed and that money not go to, like, parties they support. Imagine a Greens member getting taxed and that money, tax money, going to the New Conservative. They're going to feel, like, disgusted by what their money is going to. They're going to feel disenfranchised, alienated. Voter turnout is going to decrease. At this point is debate winning. We think we can win here because it harms the most vulnerable populace, right? Rich people are still going to be able to pay for like these hospitals and like private institutes, but what we need is like social services for poor people. That's extremely bad. That's what happens on their side. So secondly, how politics is better on our side. We live in a polarized society. Social media run rampant. These are unprecedented times where people are extremely suspicious of the government already. So how does state funding affect the political system? Firstly, parties' funding is not proportional to the voter base. So either they get a flat amount of money, so they've told us they get a flat amount of money, but what's the results of this? Secondly, there's like far less transparency for parties. We think it's like far easier to be corrupt because we have things like people like being able to see where this money is coming from. But when the state is simply funding them, we think there's a lot of time for like we think there's a lot of space for corruption because they haven't actually described like whether this is going to be an independent institute that like hands out this money. Like, who gets to decide how much money is going out in a year? Who gets to decide how much money is like being spent on this? We think that's extremely harmful because if a party is able to get into power, we think they could manipulate this very easily. Thirdly, it hurts smaller parties. This is in direct contradiction to their case. We have a diverse parliament already. Small parties this means small parties are getting less money. Like ACT and Greens are able to grow on this voter base because they get so many private contributions. We think that when this money is like extremely decreased, like even if they are getting funding, because there's massive funding necessary for these small parties to get popular. That's why we think that it's at the detriment of them. So what does the system look like on their side? Firstly, it's less diverse because small parties are going to suffer. Like, they need this money to grow. They need this private funding to advertise more so than the bigger parties. Secondly, Secondly, and most importantly, we get social outrage, right? People feel bad. People don't want to engage in politics. We get far less voter turnout. This is extremely harmful. So proud to oppose.
So we're now here at the speaker for the speech, and now we'll get on the second speaker for the proposition.
Sorry about that. Just like Sean and Asian joined Scroll, AFF is going to take this debate because the thing that that first negating speaker forgot to engage with is all of our material around on how private donors are just these bad actors. They tried to say it's just going to. I think they tried to characterize them as just looking like these small little people, but obviously no. It's going to be these huge companies. It's going to be the people that have the capacity to donate literal millions of dollars into these parties. I think as far as that was the case, that made all of that material on deregulation and the huge harms that from Lucas stood in this debate, and that was damning for the case. Three things I'm going to be talking about. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the cost, which was their main question in the debate. If we can eliminate this, then it's very difficult for NEG to win. But secondly, I'm going to be talking about the type of quality and policy you get through in government. Thirdly, I'm going to be giving you a split point on why this is principally correct. Firstly then, let's talk about costs. Here I just want to quickly clarify. They tried to say we need to specify how much we're going to spend. Look, we told you right from Lucas, it's just going to be for a sustainable marketing campaign and party. I don't think we need to specify this because obviously the size of the party depends on where you are, the different country you're in, how many people are in the party. Look, it's just going to be enough for a sustainable marketing campaign and to sustain your party. That's what it was. Now then, let's talk about why companies are going to be the majority of these donors. Firstly, it's because they just have the most money. They can just outbuy and spend way more money than these voters. But second is to say most voters don't actually donate. It's generally only those people who are really committed. Like if you're a swing voter, you don't want to vote for National or Labour because you're not committed to either party, so you don't want to vote for them. Now then, let's talk about the material costs. If we can disprove this, then most of their benefits don't stand in this debate. Why was it that these weren't going to be a high cost? Well, the first thing they tried to push is that it's going to be a lot of these small parties that we're going to fund. But let's then engage our material on how we brought you on how there's going to be a far lower barrier for on how it's going to be a far higher barrier for entry. So that means you can't just have these random small parties getting in. It's so that significantly reduces a lot of the material. They then tried to tell us that we're in a financial crisis and that we're suddenly not going to be able to pay teachers at all. Look, we can literally fund these huge industries like teaching. So I think what that then means is that we can fund a bunch of parties. I'd like to note, I think that they're overestimating the cost of parties. And that's because in the status quo, parties vastly overspend because of all those mix Lucas brought to you about how it's super beneficial, and how like donations are super beneficial to be able to market, but also just to be able to like sustain your, but also just be able to like buy out a lot of people in your party, right? So what this all meant is that, the cost was just significantly like more affordable than they thought it was. If we can literally fund the entire education system, I think we can just fund a couple of parties. But look, I'm willing to accept a marginal cost, and maybe we're going to accept like a marginal cost to like teachers' pay. But let's look at the trade-off here. What are the trade-off? Because it's these huge corporations now having a huge influence over these parties. What are the impacts of this? First is that you can fire workers easily. Fire workers fire easily. That's huge because being fired, first of all, just sucks. But secondly, it just hurts your income stream. But secondly, so you have just a lack of safety. So so maybe we have like marginally less money to spend on infrastructure on their side. But on their side, there's no safety regulations to be able to actually ensure these companies are making that good infrastructure. So overall, these things are just significantly worse on their side of the house. Now then, moving on to my, they also tried to say that like small parties are going to get a lot of the votes. Two responses here. Firstly, is that no, I would say, get a little private. They also try to say that small parties get, moving on to my next point on like how you get better representation on outside. The first thing they try to say is that small parties get a lot of these private donations. Two responses there. First is that no, they don't. You donate to the ones that actually can get change. You'd rather donate to Labour or National because those are the ones that you perceive to have a much larger change because of all those Lucas brought to you. But secondly, it wasn't the fact that the small parties didn't have enough funding. It was the fact that the funding was unequal because Labour could always outbuy a billboard slot on the Greens, and that meant that they were actively shutting down the opportunities. That was the issue here. Now then, let's just talk about why this is like so important to have like more equal funding and to not just have like Labour and National dominate these elections through their donations. Three things here. First is that's more democratic. You're a Green voter or like for a small leftist party that maybe doesn't meet that threshold. What that means is you see Labour everywhere. You perceive them as having a higher capacity. So you're more likely to vote for Labour because you don't see the point in voting for the Greens, even though the Greens do represent your viewpoints more. On our side, you're not likely to do that. That means we just have a more democratic and representative society where people can confidently vote for who they want for. We're a democracy, we should uphold our principles of democracy. But secondly, so you just have to do more stuff. Elections are going to be more competitive now. You have to compete again. Labour has now greater competition against like the Greens and ACT Party. So now they just have to like do more stuff. They have to do more policies. They can't just stand by. They actually have to like implement things. But thirdly, is that now you create more coalitions have more power. When Green holds 15% of the vote instead of 8% of the vote, what that means is they can demand for more change. They can demand for more of the policy when they make they can demand for more policies when they make deals. That's really big. That means we get more of that donation that actually matters. Now then, let's also talk about the point that went unresponded to and why we have a significantly more efficient parliament. Because there are two reasons as to why you just spend as a politician you just spend like so much time as to getting these donations, right? Firstly is that donations are important because of all Lucas's mechanisms. Also know that you want to go overboard to get like more funding than other parties. So that means you just push a lot and spend a lot of time trying to get these donations. But secondly is that to like support their own parties, they need to like fund these MPs with high salaries. So what this means, also know that's very hard because firstly is because like people don't want to donate generally, like those swing voters. But secondly is they want to get like as much out of there as possible. So what we see is politicians spending like 1/3 of their time trying to raise donations. That means that like 1/3 of their time not spent on actual important legislation. That as far as we get a far more efficient government, that's something that was a huge benefit on our side. Now then, before moving on to my split point on why this is principally correct, I'll take you why.
So you've said both that there's a higher barrier for entry in terms of who we're giving this money to, but also that you're going to get massive amounts of diversity in parliament because small parties get money.
But like, okay, obviously like the Greens and there are these small parties, like there's still like at least like 10 parties that can probably meet this threshold, right? We're just going to get out all those other parties that probably can't, but those 10 parties are still going to give us more diverse thought in Parliament, right? So now, moving on to my principle. Why states have a lot of coercive power over people? Why is this? Firstly, they control your life. They control the police force. They control laws. They control the healthcare. They control the police. They just completely control every aspect of your life. But second, it's difficult to leave. It's because your home is already set up there. It's because you have families and communities. It's because it's difficult to immigrate. So that means since they have so much coercive power over people and it's hard to escape, that means that your main obligation should be to serve the people. And as a state, your main obligation should be to serve the people. There are two reasons as to why we serve the people more on our side. Firstly, you're spending less time pandering to companies and more time actually trying to get through legislation and doing things to the people. But secondly, is that you don't vote on who has like the most. You don't like vote on who has like the most funding. You instead vote on who you actually want to vote on. So as far as our side fulfills a state's main obligation better, that was an independent path to victory and something we could win on.
For that speech, I'd just like to remind you all again, and hopefully for the last time, to watch the volume with lots of information, and I will welcome the second speaker for the opposition up to the floor.
Wait, can I get my blazer? I need to look good for the cameras. Sorry.
The affirmative team would give the same amount of money to the National Party as they would give to the legalized cannabis party. This money is going to parties who, ultimately aren't even going to get enough votes to get into Parliament anyway. This money is being wasted, and we've already talked about how, we need this money to go to better things. 3 points in the speech. Firstly, why the political system is worse under state funding. Secondly, why tax money is better spent elsewhere. Thirdly, a split point on how the wrong people get funded. The first two were points of clash. Now, first of all, under the why the political system is worse under state funding, what do they say here? They say parties only cater to rich places but under private funding because that's where they get their money from. Now, this is not true because what parties care about most is votes, not like what's going to get the money to do marketing, but votes, right? Because while marketing can have an impact on the votes, most people already vote for one party and the marketing won't actually make a difference there. This is only affecting a small amount of people and it will actually tip their votes, right? So, for example, Labour is not going to cater to rich people under a private funding system because, firstly, these rich places are less likely to vote for Labour anyway because Labour doesn't support their interests. But secondly, because this would alienate all of their supporters who live in poor areas. So, they're not going to get any votes if they cater to these rich places. So, we proved here that this outcome that the AFF said is wrong. The parties are not just going to cater to rich places under the status quo. We can also see that, in the status quo where we have private funding, we don't see the Green Party catering to all these rich areas. Now, what else do they say here? They say that parties will have more time to spend on other things because they have less time to spend, gathering funding, right? But, firstly, a lot of the time funding is already insured. They have these agreements with these businesses, with these places. They don't have to spend a lot of time getting that funding because, this funding is already, insured anyway for these parties, right? But even if it isn't insured, and even if these parties do have to go out of their way to get this funding, well, firstly, this time-saving thing is only going to apply to these large parties, because these large parties are going to be easily able to get through this tough criteria barrier that we've heard from AFF, because obviously they're reputable, right? But small parties are going to have to spend their time building their reputation, building their credibility to be able to even apply for this funding in the first place. This particularly applies to like new parties who are trying to rise up the rank. This is not going to give them more time. So what this is doing, this is disproportionately like benefiting these large parties. When we hear all from AF about how we're going to help the small parties, this doesn't apply here. Now, what else do they say? They say that voters are more educated because now they're getting marketing from all the parties instead of just one. This is not true. What voters are is more confused. There's so much advertising that's getting around under their case because now all of a sudden all of these parties have the right to advertise, right? We see like the legalized cannabis party, as I said, like all of these small parties alongside the large parties, they all have billboards. Why is this bad? Because firstly, people don't know, like just by seeing a billboard, whether that party is a party that's actually likely to get into parliament or not. So like if they are influenced by that, their vote might go to nothing because they might be voting for a party that they think will be getting into parliament because, oh, look, they've got good marketing now that they have a lot of money, but that vote actually goes nowhere because that party like isn't a party that's going to get enough votes to go in, get into parliament anyway, right? So, and also they don't see these parties as a whole because there's so many different parties that they're seeing billboards of. They're only seeing like little things from each party. So they're not getting the big picture of parties. All they're getting is like, there's one little policy from each party. And a lot of the time, they're just going to be more confused, right? The people who are influenced by these billboards in the first place are people who don't necessarily know much about the political system, because people who do know about the political system will do their own research and the marketing won't affect them as much, right? So we think that these voters are just going to be more confused. They're not going to know who they're voting for. And when they do vote, they're more likely to vote for a party where their vote won't actually go anywhere. Now, we actually see a large contradiction in Affirming's case here, as they say that there's a high barrier for entry for these parties to get money, but they also say that they're going to get political diversity. Now, how does this happen? How do these small parties who are like rising up the ranks, maybe new parties, how do we see new parties get into power, like get this funding? Like where do they get that funding, that initial funding from to get enough reputability to be able to apply for this state funding? I'll take a PY.
Okay, so if people just vote for the same party, then why do like the voting percentages between Labour and National change?
Okay. We see like, first of all, I'm talking about only like a small group of people who are likely to be split, right? We see most people vote for the same party. We do recognize that there's some people that will switch voting. That's what changes the vote percentages. But also, like if you remember our first speaker's case, where we spoke about how like we're more likely to see these parties just stay in power if the system is under play, because these parties have an influence to like manipulate the way that this funding is being delivered to give funding to parties that will most benefit their own agenda. So what we actually see under your side of the house is that these parties are less likely to like shift in and out of parliament, and we're likely to just see the same parties in power. Now, second point of clash, why this tax money is better spent elsewhere. What do they say here? This is a critical flaw in their model, and that they say that all parties are going to be getting equal funding, right? Now, this is completely wasted money to all these parties who aren't going to be getting enough votes anyway to get into parliament, right? We're giving the same amount of votes to these really small parties as we're giving to the major like party giants, right? So either, firstly, like the money is wasted when people need it most, right? Like all this money that's going to the legalized cannabis party, that advertising isn't actually having an effect because people aren't going to vote for legalized cannabis anyway. Not enough people vote for them in the status quo, right? So all of that money is going somewhere where it's not needed. We already spoke about it first, where all that money should be going, where we're taking that money away from. It's healthcare, it's public transport, it's these institutions that are like catering to the vulnerable people in our country. Or if they want to avoid this, they have to defend the like really strict party regulations. This is the key contradiction in their case, right? Like they're denying the democratic right for people to run for parliament if they're like having this really high bar for people to be getting funding, right? Regardless of if these parties were likely to get in anyway, there's this principal right that parties have to be able to run like and have a chance to get in, right? This means that these small parties that cater to the niche issues don't get in, so diversity fails on their side, even though they try to tell you that it improves. So we told you, like at AFF, the cost that this money is being taken away from and where it's being delivered isn't beneficial. So this is debate winning because they either have to defend, firstly, taking money away from these crucial places where it belongs and like spending people's tax money on parties that they didn't even vote for, that they might be strongly against, or secondly, they have to defend our less diverse parliament. Both of these things are extremely bad for our country, and they have to defend one of them at least, which means we win the debate there. Now, split point, how the wrong people get funded under their system, right? So what gives parties these money when they're privately funded? Firstly, if these parties stand for something, they're likely to get money because people will want to pay them. Secondly, they need to be agreeable and they need to appeal to a lot of people to get that money. Thirdly, they need to be seen as a capable party who, because people need to believe that this money can have an impact and that these parties are going to be able to deliver on the promises they make. So these parties need to be credible, professional. They need to have these things in the status quo, right? What these barriers do is they filter out harmful parties in the status quo because they can't get the funding. So how are these barriers removed when these parties are state funded, right? Because firstly, the state can't seem biased. It's incentivized to fund as many parties as possible because otherwise people will think that the state is selfishly funding and are corrupt, right? Parties want to be voted in, so they won't want this image of being selfish and corrupt. So even if these parties don't stand for clear goals or things that are good for the populace, they're still going to get funding because they don't want to seem like they're being corrupt, right? Secondly, the parties only have to appeal to one group instead of a large amount of people that can give them this funding. This means that even if there is a strong criteria from their side of how a party can get in, they don't have to have this widespread appeal. All they have to do is appeal to these state people who might have their own agendas. They likely will have their own agendas. Their own agendas will likely be to get their party back in. So what do we see here? We see it's a good chance that more extreme parties are going to get funded in. This money is not we don't have these great filters that we already have to filter out these really bad parties looking like Nazi level stuff here. Where this could be really bad if we get these incredibly harmful parties getting all this funding. They don't need the money. The money should be going to the healthcare system. Sorry about that delay.
Are we good? Okay, cool. Team AF lost this case when they switched up their model at third, when they only responded to our points with no analysis, no actual mitigation or anything. They just said, we're wrong, so they're right. They provided nothing more than that. First of all, they've changed their model halfway through their case. Second of all, the case is full of contradictions. And third of all, there's no analysis between the steps of what they're actually offering you. So, I have identified two main points of clash, but before I get onto that, I'm just going to address some miscellaneous rebuttal. First of all, they changed their case. They tried saying at first that these people need an accountant, they need an economist. That was their case. At third, they then said, now these small parties need a certain amount of votes to be able to qualify for this funding. So we're entirely confused as to how these small parties qualify for this funding. How are they supposed to run if they don't have any funding because they're not even allowed to use their personal funds? How are they supposed to get any of the vote if they don't have any funding? How are they supposed to meet this threshold that they've given with no funding? It doesn't make sense. Second piece of miscellaneous rebuttal, they haven't addressed how independent MPs come into this. Independent MPs, in case the Affirming team doesn't know, is independent local politicians who run for their region who don't affiliate with a party. Do these people qualify for the state funding? Or do they not? Because ultimately that's a huge leg up or a huge disadvantage for these independent MPs that they have not addressed. So, first point of clash is how does this affect voters? Which we think is ultimately the most important thing. And second of all, how does this state funding affect parties? So, firstly, under how does this affect the voters? Firstly, this is kind of in two sections. First of all is how do voting habits change? The Affirming team here had massive gaps between the arguments, so let me fill that in for you. They said that small parties get more funding. This means that they get more votes. This means that more people vote for small parties. This means that small parties have more sway. Now, thing is, firstly, they haven't said how these billboards that they're giving out actually leads to educated voters. They've said now these small parties can outbid Labour on a billboard, and now that means more people are going to vote for them, and that means that these voters are somehow more educated. We don't understand these gaps at all, because first of all, this is they're trying to give funding, but it's way too much, or it's way too little.
Point.
So either this sustainable funding, which is what they said that they would give these parties sustainable funding to help their growth. Now, sustainable funding for Labour is not the same as sustainable funding for National. So either, firstly, these small parties do not get enough money to be able to actually get outbid Labour on these billboards or whatever, or they get way too much funding and they've got all this money and ultimately it's just a drain on the taxpayers' resources. And this leads me into my second point under this voters is the difference in life that these voters will experience. AFF gave you a principal point and they said that was an independent path to victory. So let me quickly shut that down. They said that people need support the most. Now, we agree with this. The people are what need support here. That means that they need their tax dollars, instead of going to funding politicians and their advertisements and their billboards, you know what it needs to go to? It needs to go to police force, which they said was so important. Healthcare, which is so important. Teaching, which we've reiterated throughout this entire thing. They cannot say that this money is entirely... They haven't said where they're getting this money from. Something has to give. They cannot just have a massive increase in money to go towards the political parties. It doesn't make sense. And something's going to give, and it's going to be the social services. That's going to be the single mothers who now go to the hospital. She can't get healthcare for her child because the nurses are striking again. The teachers are striking again. Everyone is striking. No one is working because no one's getting paid enough. Because all these states' essential services are not getting any funding because this funding is instead going to these political parties. These political parties instead could be getting their money from from private sources. So, moving on to my second point of clash. Before I do that, I'll take a point of information.
Okay, so can't you meet this threshold through just having accountants that want to join the Green Party? Why do you need money to do that?
Because you have to pay the accountant. Because that's how things work. Is if you need an accountant for your party, you have to pay the accountant, and that money has to come somewhere. And now that can't come out of your own pocket, it can't come out of someone else's pocket, it has to come from the state. Except, where is the state getting this money from? It's coming straight from these healthcare services, this police force. We're not entirely sure how they're having these small parties get set up with these thresholds when they're not allowed to spend any money to do it. So, on to how does state funding affect these parties. Now, I'd like to point out that the individual voters are what matter most here. But the thing is, they tried saying that because they shut down that point, they win the debate. They haven't shut down that point. They haven't addressed where they're getting this money from, and that is how we won. We won by proving to you that these people matter the most, and something has to give. There is not enough money for both healthcare services and all this funding that they're giving to parties. So, first of all, how is this state funding going to affect small parties? AFF said that we love diversity, and these dominant parties are completely getting rid of that. They said this because of outreach and engagement. Firstly, we agree that we do like small parties in government. It's great, but we don't like giving them the same amount of money. The thing is, they said that these National and Labour voters, parties, don't care about their voters because they already have enough money to get into Parliament. This is just so factually incorrect that we're not entirely sure how they got that leap. But the thing is, National and Labour, two big parties, only one of them can be in, which means that they always have to be catering to the voters. They always have to be catering to the people who can actually get them into Parliament. The funding that they're getting from these from these independent sources doesn't matter if they're not actually getting into Parliament. All right. Second of all, we want to say that it's not just based on outreach. It's actually whether or not these people, these voters, actually agree with their policies. That means people don't vote for legalized cannabis, not just because they have not just because they don't have enough funding. It's because people don't want to vote for a party whose only policy is legalizing cannabis. It's ridiculous. All right. Third of all, how did these small parties get their initial funding? I've already gone over this. I'm not going to go over it again. It doesn't make sense. Fourthly, they're providing a barrier for entry for people running for Parliament, and that is ridiculous. We went on this point alone that we're letting people run for Parliament. We're letting people be involved in their political institutions. They are saying, no, you have to meet these thresholds, but then you also have to get votes. But then no, we're going back to you need to make these thresholds. We're not sure how their case stands here when they're continuously changing it. They also said that they just needed an accountant. or an economist. That means that Luca's point about a Nazi party, these radical parties, can get in because then get this funding just because they have an accountant or an economist. They can't have it both ways, and it doesn't make sense. All right? People have the right to run for government if that's what they want to do. People have the right to not vote for them. But the thing is, ultimately, what matters here is the voters. And how they are voting isn't just based on which party has the most billboards. It's based on their actual policies. And so if they have this state funding where everyone has the same amount of funding, they get massive detriments to the individual voters, the people who need their money the most, who don't want their tax money going towards political parties. They want it going towards healthcare, teaching, and things that actually affect their daily lives. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now we'll move to the replies portion of the debate. So I'd like to welcome back the leader of the opposition.
It's probably me.
Sorry, guys. Auckland Blue have radically altered their model at third to say that the government would pay these parties in proportion to the effect that this money would have on these parties, right? They also brought up the idea that this criteria is correlated to the amount of votes that these parties get, right? At first, they strongly affirmed that these parties would get equal funding. It's clear that Auckland Blue have realised their mistake later on in the case, but they have to defend the case and the model that they proposed at first. They can't run with what was given at third. Now, our burden in this debate was to prove that either the taxpayers' money is better spent elsewhere, or that these private donations increase the efficacy of Parliament, right? We've done this through these 2 points of clash. Firstly, how state funding harms voters. Secondly, how state funding harms parties, right? So under why state funding harms voters. What is their push here? Their push here is that voting habits improve. They say that we get more votes for small parties, right? First of all, they didn't mechanize how more advertising, more billboards actually creates the substantial, sustainable votes that they're saying that they're going to get, right? What did we say here? We said that people are smarter than Affirming wants to characterize them as they are. Most people will just have their belief and they'll only vote for the one party anyway. They're not going to be influenced by this advertising. But secondly, these voters who are not as smart, and the voters who do fall under the characterization that we heard from AFF, they're going to be bombarded by all this information. They're going to be confused. They're not going to know whether their vote is actually going towards the party that could get into Parliament. What's happening is that their right to make an impact to the country is removed because they don't know whether their vote is going to legalize cannabis party and just completely going to waste, or whether it's going to breaking the tipping point between National Labour, which could make a big influence on the country, right? Also, what do we say here at first? Something that they completely ignored, not responded to, not engaged with, is that people are likely to vote less because people are mad that their money, their tax money, is going to parties that they hate. Because this money goes to all parties, it means that people who strongly support the Greens, their money is going towards ACT, a party that they likely strongly dislike. This creates so much frustration in these people. This creates less voter turnout. All this social tension. We expanded on this at first. We've heard nothing about how this is not happens from AF, right? They say that parties only cater to rich places. We shut this down by saying that parties care about votes more than money. So what do we say here? We say that all this money is going to waste. This money is needs to be spent on all the problems we have in this country. Even if it's a small amount of money that's going towards these places, we have no money to spare right now. This money is going to have to come at a cost. That cost will be at the cost of the vulnerable people in this country that need that money to survive, to live, like this is so harmful to them, so we win on that point. Second point of clash, how state funding harms parties, right? What is their push here? That they get more diversity in parliament, but this is ultimately, like, they can't prove this because of this major contradiction in their case. We hear from some of their speakers that they're going to have this harsh criteria for parties to get in. We hear from other speakers that it's likely that they can get small parties in and that, like, they can just build up these ground root parties. They can't have both. They either have strict funding and criteria that would push out these radicalized parties, that would push out like the parties that don't belong in parliament, or they have really low bars for funding, which means that like they have to pay all this money to all these different parties when that money should be going to other places. Firstly, they didn't mechanize properly how advertising equals votes. It doesn't. Even if they do get more advertising for all these parties, they didn't mechanize how that advertising actually influenced people's behavior, because we proved that it doesn't. That people care more about like the research that they're doing or the views that they already have. Secondly, if the criteria is high, like we can't see new parties get in, because how do they get their initial funding to become a party in the first place, to even apply for this funding in the first place? Thirdly, if we believe that it's a low criteria to get into to get this funding, we can see all these radical parties coming in that I spoke about in my split, and like this is really ultimately so harmful. But most importantly, the principal right for parties to run is removed if there's such a high criteria. Even if they're not likely to get in, they have a right to run. We completely get this fallout of democracy under AFF.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now to close the debate, we'll welcome back the leader of the proposition.
At the very minimum of our case, at least moderates know that these different parties actually exist, right? Because I don't think it's that hard to make out the fact that seeing more advertisement just was more likely for more people to vote for them, when the reason we framed to you why National and Labour are so popular is because they have the most amount of funding to reach the most people, so they're the ones that are the most dominant, right? Down the line, we've told you two things. Firstly, they just need a level of structure to be a political party. There's nothing about votes, and our model is consistent. But also secondly, at the minimum, it's just extending beyond National Labour, right? It's telling these moderates that different parties actually exist between different ideologies, and that's where we win on our diversification points. Because what's symmetric at the end of this is the level of accountability. You still need to vote for them to like get them in, so they still have same levels of accountability. 2 points in. Firstly, on whether political parties get better or not, and secondly, whether people are better off when you have state-funded or private-funded political parties. Firstly, what have we told you, right? We've told you that the problem in status quo is two things. Firstly, there's dominant political parties because they have lots of fundings to continue to dominate, and then secondly, this looks like having lots of marketing and ads, and thus lots of capacity to be able to influence voters. Their main push on this was instead that small parties rely on these funds, right? What have we told you? Firstly, we've just told you that like they're mostly outbidded by big parties for ads, but they're just seen as less capacity when they have less amounts of money, right? We solved this by two things. Firstly, having equal levels of funding in the sense of having equal levels of advertisement, but then secondly, we also just get better quality of smaller parties when they have more funding, right? They become less radical, as I framed to you, when you're actually able to give them money to influence and have like these decisions like having better accountants. They then told us that these individuals get confused and their votes are wasted, right? We've told you two responses. Firstly, note here that they concede on their side that voters are smart, so they're likely to just research them, right? I don't see like the people are being like a confused part. But also secondly, at least we are able to expose them to different views, right? I don't see how this isn't symmetric when these individuals who likely get confused see the same things when they see like a National or Labour billboard. We've then told you then, on where we win this debate, is the diversification of parties, right? We've told you two things. Firstly, you can actually vote for different parties and have a more diverse political system and parliament when you actually know that they exist, when you know that they're out there and cater to specific beliefs and values that you may support. But also secondly, know that your vote matters more when they no longer pander towards rich voters, when they no longer pander towards rich companies, and your vote matters more when you're actually able to vote for individuals that make decisions that are best for you. But no, here we also have like efficiency, right? We've told you not only do they have like better, like make better decisions, but then also they care less about funding, which Jamie has already framed to you takes up like a big proportion of the time and the marketing that they they do. We've then told you, and where we also continue, as I framed to you, is that we also just inform the moderates, right? Two things on this. Firstly, they no longer just see that it's national or Labour, but then secondly, know that you look for different areas and you're actually able to vote for different parties. The last line of attack they tried was that radical parties get in, but I think we've already adequately addressed this at Lauren, right? Two things on this. Firstly, because Lauren's already told you that they're unpopular, so you don't vote for them, but then secondly, there's not enough people to vote them in to begin with, so they never make it into parliament, so they never make any decisions. Now at the end of this point then, right, not only have we been able to just successfully prove that we get a more diverse parliament, but also they've never actually able to meet the burden of proving to us why you don't get less diverse parliaments. Doesn't really make too much sense. Secondly then, let's just talk about whether people are better or worse off, right? Firstly, we told you, and that this is never properly addressed, only weighed up by them, that these companies disproportionately fund political parties and they have severe levels of lobbying power in making bad decisions. Their only weighing response to this was that we need different fundings for other avenues in terms of things like public transport and healthcare, right? We've told you at Lauren that firstly you just redirect funds from things like elections, but also secondly, Jamie told you that they just typically overspend. So in status quo, right, what we see is that these political parties who are funded by private companies do things like deregulation of certain industries and lowering taxes, or like secondly, like I've told you, that they block legislature that genuinely makes good to society because it's in the benefits of the rich company investors. What we've then told you then also is that private donations are really bad when they're given by rich actors and voters, right? Because not only firstly do you pander towards these rich actors, but then secondly it manifests in who you vote for and in who funds, like what areas are funded, and we told you that's likely to be the rich areas. At the end of this, not only do we win because we're better off for people, but we're actually better off for the legislative system, for laws, and that's why we win. Thank you.